That Naturopathic Podcast. TNP.
Hello there.
Hi, and thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. Michelle Pobega, naturopathic doctor.
And I'm Dr. David Miller, ND, and we hear your frustrations. This show is for you.
This show is for you if you're feeling like your current healthcare strategy is not getting to the root cause or the underlying reasons for your health.
This show is for you if you've been told that you're fine, but you definitely don't feel very well.
This show is for you if you're walking out of your doctor's office with 1, 2, 3, 4, or even 5 medications without any mention of diet, lifestyle, or a long-term game plan.
This show is for you if you've got several specialists taking care of you, but no one is really putting all the pieces together.
This show is for you if you believe that health should be part of healthcare. These problems have solutions.
We know it.
Our patients know it.
And we want you to know it.
Naturopathic medicine is the solution that you should know about.
Welcome to another episode of That Naturopathic Podcast. Dr. David Miller, ND, Dr. Michelle Pobega, ND. What's up?
Hey, pal. How are you?
Good.
Good. So today we're going to talk about three specific labs that we think
We can do better.
have a lot of merit. Just in general, we could do better by our patients with labs. So I think the thing is there's a lot of labs that we like to see and we would order that medical doctors also order. But then there are some key parameters that based on
parameters
that how medical doctors are, I guess, allowed to order labs, that they seem a little bit limited as to what they order. And I have often gotten pushback when I've sent clients to their doctors to ask for more comprehensive lab work, and the doctor will say, you don't need that. That's kind of what they say to the client. But I think it's also because if that initial marker is not abnormal, then the Ministry of Health or whatever the restrictions are does not necessarily allow them to take the next steps and continue ordering further labs. Am I correct in saying that, Dave?
Well, mostly I would just say qualifier that this is pretty Ontario-centric conversation with labs, although it may be different in some provinces. And in Canada, I would say it's probably similar. This would probably not be the case if you see a functional sort of medicine doctor in the US or whatever.
But that's typically the case. They have to start with the first step. And if there's nothing weird about the first step, they are basically, I don't want to say
there's merit in that. You
but
can understand.
But maybe they don't move forward, right? And I get
there's merit in some structure in logarithm or algorithms and stuff like that. There's merit in it for sure. But we're just here to point out that sometimes
there's also
too
merit.
Restrictive.
There's also merit in certain things being tested a little bit more thoroughly.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when I think a key thing here at the beginning, just to say too, is like, we're not talking about some, like, I think some, let's call it some whack testing that some naturopaths do. I think it's cool. Like, and some of it will actually not be whack someday because, you know, the parameters or line of what is acceptable science always changes.
Science constantly changing, guys. It's not religion.
Yeah. So let's just sort of say colloquially or whatever, what we're not talking about whack tests today. We're talking about conventional labs that we just do a little differently, or we do a little bit more comprehensively, or in the context of other labs. So we're not talking about, like, you know, wacky tests that you learned about from TikTok.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's important to say at the beginning here, because it's really, we're doing a somewhat flexible interpretation of conventional lab tests rather than some crazy.
Yeah, it's just stuff. Really just functional.
It's pretty simple, isn't it?
Functional information that can be important for the foundations of giving good care for a client. Basically, like, we're not asking for anything wild. I think like. So there's like three things that Dave, there's three things that Dave and I have come to want to discuss today when it comes to lab parameters, where we feel we could be a little bit more investigative so that we can get a little bit more of the fuller picture of what's going on. And there have been times where Dave and I get information from doctors and they don't run maybe some of those extra tests, and we run it independently and we find the abnormalities. And that's why we think that these 3 areas are worth investigating a little bit longer, just for better patient care, right? Because that's really the ultimate goal. And we're not, and like Dave was saying, we're not asking for anything wildly crazy. There's just some simple things that don't
Yeah.
actually cost a lot of money either. So
We're not sending your, dried placenta away to get it encapsulated, or whatever.
yeah.
Like, and again, I'm not trashing that. I'm just saying there's varying levels of what is considered normal and all that. And this is pretty normal stuff. So
And I
why don't
and
we
I
tell,
think and I think just based on like some of the most common health concerns that are coming into the office, these are
that's key.
also not outrageous asks. You know what I mean? I feel like this really, these particular lab parameters really do help understand some of
Actually,
a lot about the most chronic common conditions that are coming in that are plaguing North Americans. I feel like these are really important things to understand.
they're widely applicable to the
Very.
vast majority of anyone who you're going to see in sort of chronic care management. And then actually in thinking about them, at least two of them of the three, and you could almost say all three of them are involved in energy, and that's something it's funny, like I work near a nuclear power plant.
Hmm.
And it's taken me, I think,
Hmm.
12, 13 years of practice to realize how important energy is. And I don't mean like just the,
Esoteric
the
energy.
well, I don't mean that. And I don't just mean the nuclear power plant where I'm living, but because that's, I mean, if we don't have power, it's not good. And if you work in the power, like energy sector, you usually are that's a valuable sector to be in terms of like economic, financial reality of life. But you know what? It's a very valuable sector to be in when you're trying to take care of chronic disease or chronic issues, because invariably, I would say, if you can make, there's always exceptions, but almost invariably, you could say if someone has more energy, they're going to do more good things, because good things usually take more effort than, sitting there and smoking dope and playing video games and drinking yourself into oblivion in the basement. I guess you could do that. But that, good things take some effort, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So an effort means energy. And so a lot of the times I spend my time not telling people what to do, all these new different things to do. It's more like, hey, let's get you the energy so you can do the things you already know you need to do or want to do. You just don't have the capacity, energy to do it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I hope so. I said it, so I hope it makes some sense. Okay, Michelle, tell them what the three are, because some people won't listen beyond that if you don't tell them what the three things are.
Okay, that was a good lead up though. We want to talk about how running ferritin in isolation doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. And we want to run some things to check your inflammatory markers, and we'll talk about those are. We want to talk about how it's important to run a full thyroid panel and not just TSH, and how you can catch things before they become bigger problems. And
just did today.
Yeah, and how doing your fasting glucose and your HbA1c is helpful, but incomplete if you are not running your fasting insulin, because there could be insulin resistance running behind the scenes before those numbers are dramatically changed, like to create concern. Before. So those are the three areas we kind of want to touch on a little bit, and we'll just kind of break them down a little bit more.
Go.
I want to start with the glucose one, if possible, because I do this a lot. I recommend this a lot because so many people are metabolically unhealthy, and this is such a big deal. So many people are not regulating their blood sugars, but here's the thing too. I'll even see people who's like HbA1c or fasting glucose. The ideal for both of those is between 5 to 5.5. That is the optimal range. And I see people at 5.7, 5.8, 5.9 for the HbA1c, which means their blood sugar for the last 3 months has not been well regulated. However, the doctors don't point it out because for some reason, the breakdown of reference ranges only says above 6 is now risk of prediabetes. And you're kind of like, no, it's still not good enough. So I already find a lot of people are kind of going underserviced because their numbers are still not quite in the optimal range. But then I have caught a lot of people whose blood sugar or HbA1c looks decent, but they are struggling with weight, or they are struggling with PCOS, or they are struggling with all sorts of stuff, brain fog, low energy, waking up in the middle of the night, whatever, which can all be blood sugar regulated. And I run their insulin, and insulin at fasting should ideally be 50 or less. according to what I have learned. And I think even less than 70, some people say, but I heard 50 is more like the sweet spot. And I will catch people who are at like an 80 to a 90 to 100. And then when you run their fasting glucose and their fasting insulin through a HOMA-IR calculator, they are in a insulin resistant state, or they're getting there. And they're not in the optimal insulin, operations values. So that is already a sign of metabolic dysfunction. And I remember going to a medical doctor. I went to a walk-in clinic to start getting some just general stuff done for myself and for my partner. And I was sitting in the office with them. And I already ran my fasting insulin a few months prior, so I already knew what it was. But for my partner, I was trying to request it. There is diabetes and different things within his familial line, so we wanted to be thorough. And I asked the doctor if they could run fasting insulin. And he said no. And I said, can I ask why? And he says, well, it wouldn't change the course of action. And I didn't say anything, so I was like, whatever, but I disagree, because if you catch metabolic insufficiency early, it does change the course of action, period, end of story. You can start preventing something before it becomes a bigger problem. That would be my approach.
What a crazy idea to try and get something.
Yeah. And I get a lot of doctors when I used to have my patients try to request this from the doctors, and every time the doctor says, you don't need that. And they would refuse, they would flat out refuse to run it. And in a society and in a culture where insulin resistance is a wild epidemic right now, I feel like we're doing a huge disservice to the population.
Agreed.
That was my soapbox. I get really heated about this topic.
Well, it's hard not to, and it's a great, we're going to talk about inflammatory markers too, which cost, I think, $3 each or something.
I think really, so. They're really inexpensive.
Super cheap. I inadvertently spent almost that much on a venti Americano from Starbucks recently.
Yeah.
I was getting rewards, but
if you also,
I paid the full price, and it's the same as the two markers to me.
Yeah.
Okay, the coffee's good, but the markers are pretty important. So what I was going to say about the markers with the inflammation is that they're oftentimes downstream from insulin.
Yeah.
So if you have insulin resistance, it's good that you brought this one up first. If you have insulin resistance, it can be pro-inflammatory. So if you have the non-specific marker of dysregulation, which is inflammation, it's just like heat in the system. Well, the first thing I usually do if someone also at the same time has metabolic resistance, insulin resistance, is fix the insulin resistance, and then sometimes the inflammation really goes down.
I've seen that happen personally. And what I find is, like, if we were to run fasting glucose and fasting insulin independently as naturopaths, it comes to like, I don't know, like $35 or something like that, which is also nothing, right? People will spend $500 on a fresh haircut, but like $30 is not that big of a deal. However, what I've also noticed that for us to do the 2-hour insulin glucose challenge, it costs around the same amount. Now, it does require, and I do this for more of my clients who have known metabolic dysfunction, so I can show them what their insulin is and glucose is at fasting. And then once they drink the disgusting, gnarly glucose drink, and I'm sorry for putting my patients through this, but it's nice to see functionally how your body responds, to do the 30-minute mark, to do it again at 1 hour, and to do it again at 2 hours, to see, like, does your body overcompensate with insulin? Does your blood sugar spike? Does it come back into a state of balance within a decent time frame or an expected time frame? All of that's also very important. So if I have clients who are willing to do that, to make sure to allocate time, because you'll have to be at the lab for 2 hours to be able to allocate for this, then I often encourage them to do this and not just the fasting insulin glucose. You just get more information for literally the same price. Almost exactly the same price, which is why not? Cool. Yeah, that's what I've
maybe
figured
I should
out.
Do it more.
Yeah.
Maybe I should do that one more.
And I find it's just so interesting to see. And then you talk to people and you're like, okay, by 2 hours.
We can find other stuff.
Right.
You can find other stuff that you're doing with that test too. So that's cool. It's 2-hour test, right?
It's a 2-hour. Yeah. So it's fasting to 2 hours. Yeah. You're something, a phone, a book, or whatever, listen to a podcast, for goodness sakes. But, because not everyone's willing to get a glucose monitor and see how their body responds to glucose. I haven't even done that, for goodness sake. You know what I mean? Like, I probably should. It'd probably be very interesting to see how my body responds to things and tweak my diet to ensure that it's metabolically sound for my needs as a learning tool. However, if you're not capable of doing that and not willing to track your glucose on a day-to-day basis, at least getting this 2-hour insulin glucose challenge tells you functionally how things are showing up for you, which is pretty informative and great.
Yeah, I wonder, you know what, I was thinking of when you start talking about it, you're going to find, you might find that rebound hypoglycemia too.
That's it.
That's neat.
I've
Okay.
seen I had one person who like dropped wildly low at 2 hours. And I was like, hey, oh, we got to do some stuff there. So yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. That's number one.
Yeah.
What do
you got for number 2?
I think you locked that one in pretty good.
I think you want to just go into the inflammatory stuff since that was a good segue.
Yeah. The ferritin, CRP, ESR.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So ferritin is a marker of long-term iron storage. It's an iron storage protein. So it's sort of like your long-term savings. If you think of, iron, it's not your cash in hand. It's sort of your long-term savings.
Hmm.
Your body's sort of storing it away. Remember, we have no controlled way of getting rid of iron. This is really important to know when you're trying to understand what the body does with iron. So anyway, we store it when we have a surplus, but big but with only one T. There is also the idea of ferritin being a acute phase reactant, which is nerdy words for it goes up when you're inflamed.
Yeah.
So, I would say the vast majority of labs I see, the doctor has not requested ferritin. Sometimes they run ferritin, which is great. And so it's like a step up because they've run, say, white blood cells, red blood cells, hemoglobin, and all that. So they get some idea of erythropoiesis and all that. However, they don't often do ferritin. Then they do ferritin in some cases, which is great if it's low. So if they've only run ferritin, and it's like low, it's bottom of the barrel, it's like 8 or 5 or something like 20. Well, it's okay. What happens though when you have ferritin levels that are sort of maybe just suboptimal, say sort of in the 40-50s range, but the patient is really, really tired, cold all the time, like they've got all the signs of maybe iron deficiency. They've got some cardiovascular risk factors, blah, blah, blah. What do you do then? Well, your ferritin looks normal. So at first cursory glance, everything looks fine. However, you need to keep in mind that ferritin is going to go up when you're inflamed. So what do Michelle and I, and probably a lot of naturopaths do? We run ESR and CRP, which are two very different markers for inflammation, which, like we said, cost just over what it costs to get a Venti Americano. And it's well worth it, because now when we have run the ferritin and it says, okay, you got all the signs of iron deficiency, but your ferritin says you're normal, but it says 80 or whatever, but your inflammation markers are like, your CRP is like 7 and your ESR is like 12 or 15, then we know we have to qualitatively take away a quantity of your ferritin, because some of your ferritin number is actually just there because you're inflamed. So your true sort of healthy iron storage is actually much less than what it appears on the paper. So that's why running ferritin in the absence of inflammatory markers is 100% a no-go in my world.
It's incomplete. You know what I've also noticed is that white blood cells, I did a lab value course with Dr. Dixon Tom years ago, and he said optimal is 5 to 7.5 for white blood cell count, where the reference range is like 4 to 11. And anything above an 8 is considered an inflammatory response or a marker of inflammation. So that's also something I look for, especially if if ESR and CRP wasn't run. I'm looking at like red blood cell production, hemoglobin levels. And I've seen this where I'm like, okay, your hemoglobin looks like it's in the tanker, but your ferritin levels look okay. Like something's not adding up.
Yep.
And then this person's like, I feel tired. And I was like, okay. And the hemoglobin levels may not be outside of quote unquote reference range that the doctor's flagging them and having a discussion to my clients about it, but they're not where they need to be for your body to show up for you the way you want them to. So anything less than like 130, I start to be a little bit suspicious about your hemoglobin levels. personally.
Yeah, that's around the same ballpark for me.
And then like if you have symptoms of fatigue and hair falling out and sallow skin and all the stuff, and your ferritin levels look decent, I'm kind of like, is it though? Like, I think we need to understand a little bit
You're
more.
eating
So
ice.
I'm with you. Yeah. Yeah. What is it called?
And
Pika?
dirt. Yeah. And dirt.
Yeah. So I just feel like there's something is off, and it is worth, like we said, they each cost $3. It's really not breaking the bank for you or Health Canada's spend for our tax dollars. So I feel like it's not that big of an ask. And frankly, a lot of people with metabolic dysfunction, a lot of people with chronic North American type diseases are usually diseases with some degree of inflammation at the root. So it wouldn't necessarily be a big ask to run those either.
Mm-hmm. What did you, I'm just a little quick segue. What did you, and we'll get back to it, but it's related to what you're talking about. I just have a case from today where the white blood cells, what did you say was optimal or normal?
5 to 7.5, according to Dr. Dixon Tom.
Okay. So
for Canadian, quantities.
Ranges and reference range units. So I've got a patient here from today, and I'll bring this person up for the third part. But interestingly enough, it applies for the inflammation part. So this person's inflammation didn't show up really high with ESR. It was only 4 millimeters per hour, and I usually start to say maybe 5 or 6 is my sort of cutoff to say there's some inflammation going on.
2 to 5. 2 to 5 is good.
Yeah.
Anything above that, there's a little bit too much.
Around the same. And then her CRP was definitely elevated. It was 3.3 milligrams per liter, and I see anything above 1.
Correct. Me too.
Okay, so we're aligned that way. But what's very interesting is her white blood cells, which are normal. I put them. I use like the green, yellow, red analogy sort of for labs. So I put yellow because her white blood cells were 9.9, and the range is up to 11. And I was like, that's
9.9. And I would
and
look
then
at
you
the
look
breakdown of her white blood
neutrophils.
cells.
Yeah, then I look at neutrophils, and she's at the absolute max for neutrophils at 7.5
so
times
some kind
10
of
to the 9 per
infection,
liter.
possibly.
Or organ infiltration, which will bring us like organ specific inflammation. So infiltration of neutrophils into the organ. High neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio is something to look for there.
So what would you say? High neutrophil to lymphocyte is infiltration into the organ?
It
as in
can
like
be
like microbial infiltration into organs?
No, as in the neutrophils are getting into they're going into the organ and sort of damaging it with oxidative stress and all that.
See.
And
got it.
She is a clear picture of thyroid disease.
I see. So here's something from my notes from Dr. Dixon Tom. High. So 5 to 7.5 is optimal, but high, especially over 8.5, is an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease and signifies a strong inflammatory process. So that's what he wrote about white blood cell count.
So that looks about right.
So just FYI. And I loved this lab course. I refer back to it all the time. And her neutrophils are also high neutrophils could be acute, localized, and generalized bacterial infection, childhood diseases, folate deficiency, chronic infections, especially with a decreased white blood cell count. So with chronic, then it might have been depleted immune system, but still, which is interesting, or just inflammation is another one for that. So anyways, just that's from my notes from DT.
So ferritin in the absence of CRP and ESR is only useful if it's low. If it's normal or high, then you have to have it at the same time as CRP and ESR to have a real indication of it. Now, do we need to beat that one anymore?
I don't think so.
I think it's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that was a great segue, that patient, into autoimmune thyroid disease.
Yeah.
Which she has, and so she's got this probably infiltration of neutrophils into the thyroid. Her generalized inflammation status is somewhat high, but I wouldn't say crazy high. And her ferritin has gone up from like single digits to 32. Yeah. So again, but with your inflammatory markers, how
Mhm.
much of that 32 do we have to sort of qualitatively take away
Yeah.
because it's due to inflammation, which is sort of
Yeah.
proven otherwise? So, what are the other labs that I ran on her, Michelle? You probably know.
You ran a full thyroid panel,
I did.
which would include TSH, which is the first step your doctors take. Some doctors will still run T4, but most of them will only run TSH as a preliminary screen, period.
Hmm. Then
Um,
T4.
but T4, which is your inactive thyroid hormone that circulates and then, as needed, is converted to the active hormone because your body's thyroid function is meant to be modulating. So it's supposed to be able to react and respond and adjust based on what's happening within the body. T3 is your active hormone that elicits the thyroid activity that we want and desire. And then in a thyroid panel, you also have reverse T3, which I think we talked about it with Dr. Paul Anderson, how when something becomes chronic, your body almost goes into like a survival state and it almost shunts more of that into T3 because it can't continue to spat out energy and exhaust itself. So reverse T3 tends to get prioritized in chronic conditions. And then it also includes two types of antibodies, anti-TPO and anti-TG. And that would be a full and proper assessment of thyroid function. Ta-da!
Yeah. Yeah. So for her, it is interesting because she would have passed with flying colors the basic TSH evaluation. If I look at her numbers here, her TSH was uh an enviable 2.16
Okay,
milli-IUs per liter.
that's pretty good. I usually say between 1 to 2, give or take 0.5. Like I still give a bit of a 0.5 buffer to be like, you're okay. But I think ideal optimal is between 1 and 2 on average.
I thought anything hovering around 1 to 2.5, I'm okay with. It's probably not
Mm-hmm.
where you need to focus, but I mean,
And
these
again,
things
it's
change
gonna
over time.
fluctuate and it's gonna
Exactly.
fluctuate based on where she is in her
The
cycle, based on
There's a ton of
stresses.
things that
So
changes. Yeah, exactly. So that's why, a TSH is like a still picture in time. It doesn't
yeah.
tell you maybe the week before it was much higher and it's coming down. So I actually wonder in her case because her thyroglobulin antibodies are elevated, and so too are TPO antibodies, and her free T4 is high normal or very replete, you could say at least, and her
Mm-hmm.
free T3 is very high normal or replete. Now, so prior to this test, maybe her thyroid was sending out quite a stimulus, right? Or her brain was sending out quite a stimulus to her
Right.
thyroid, and it produced that T4 and T3,
Right.
and therefore it brought down her thyroid stimulating hormone because it got those numbers up. So
Yeah.
the free T4 and T3 are good enough that why would the brain keep sending the signal to the thyroid to stimulate more? So that's why the antibodies are really, really helpful to understand. And like she's got dry skin, she's tired as hell. Um, what else? She's cold all the time. Like, come on, man. You know, you got to look at the patient too.
Yeah.
So labs are great,
Yeah.
but you got to look at them in the context of the signs and symptoms. We've said that about a million times.
And I find that women in general tend to be more prone to those types of symptoms and to hypothyroidism type symptoms, whether it's subclinical hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, some other form of hypothyroidism. But antibodies can be elevated. I think I even heard up to even like 10 years before your TSH levels might be affected enough to show a thyroid dysfunction, but they could be in the background just kind of like affecting thyroid health, which is
Mm-hmm.
wild, which is also why I think this gets missed a lot, or this particular condition gets missed until it gets much more severe. And again, this is an opportunity to be more proactive and preventative. I often recommend women to do a full thyroid panel at least once every 2 years because a lot can change in 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it's always good to just run that to ensure antibodies are not being wildly activated and causing a muck behind the scenes.
I like it.
But, you know, call me crazy for thinking about being proactive about people's health.
Call you crazy for other reasons, not that one.
Thanks, Dave. I'm not even going to argue with that because I know it's true. But yeah, I've caught this like you, where I've run the full thyroid panel and antibodies are elevated. And I was like, maybe they don't have full Hashimoto's thyroiditis or whatever, but we've caught some sort of inflammatory, autoimmune, immune dysregulatory thing happening. And if we can nip that in the bud or get a hold of that sooner than later, man, we can help save somebody's quality of life.
And give them, like, validate this poor woman, like today, just validate her experience. So she goes to the doctor and she gets her TSA. Oh, you're fine. I'm not fine.
Yeah.
I'm exhausted.
I beg to differ.
Yeah. So validating labs can be nice and validating, and hopefully actionable too.
I don't know why, but I just thought of this. Have you seen these memes on Instagram? On Instagram, you're not on Instagram very much, but there's these things where it's somebody's funeral. There's a video at someone's funeral, and it's from the perspective of the person that's deceased. And it says, my doctor comes to my funeral. So we checked your labs and everything seems to be normal. Get medical doctors, but a lot of times this is a common patient complaint when people come to see naturopaths. They're like, listen, I feel like garbage, but my doctor says my labs are normal. And and then patients are still at a loss without any solutions or without any understanding as to why. And that's why doing that extra little bit of those extra little steps with some of these lab markers can be of great value.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But anyways. Ta-da.
Well, funny meme. And I hope that this podcast was of great value with the three, not the three pretty important labs that we can either look at in the context of other labs, patient signs and symptoms, big picture, and just do a little bit more thorough job. I think we'd catch a lot of chronic disease contributors and would validate a lot of people's experience and help people with some energy so that then they could do the stuff that they want to do. We don't always need to tell them to do more stuff. So yeah. Closing notes.
Context.
Is that good?
Just context is good. We need context for labs, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a singular number. Everything has to be in context, meaning comparing it with other labs and seeing what the bigger picture is, putting it
and knowing the
against
limitations
people's
of
symptoms. And exactly. So context is always very important when it comes to assessing somebody's health and how to best move forward from that. And that's the purpose of us being a little bit more thorough with our lab testing. Part of it.
All right. Sounds good. Catch you next week.